Okay, let me introduce Gean. I met Gean, I knew of Gean's work initially through his editing of the Efflux issue on accelerationism, and then following up with his work on Name Publications, which is a very, very exciting small press, I think committed to being small for important reasons, not just through fortune or misfortune. It seemed to me that what Gean was doing through both Cannonball, which is the non-profit space that he runs, he's a director of in Miami, Florida, USA, but also through the publication, through Name Publications, is to kind of promote a kind of a way of doing art which is not the standard contemporary art model. Okay? And there's two ways in which I think Gean promotes this. One is through a kind of commitment to discourse, to ideas, which is in a way not held back by what the artists in the scenes he's involved in are doing, but he makes a demand upon those scenes. And secondly, I think through Cannonball, he'll speak more about this maybe in his talk. Through Cannonball, what he does is try and use the importance of the art scene in the regeneration of Miami, its redevelopment through large-scale international capital investment, to try and use that in a way which doesn't simply turn art into decorative objects for rich people in the condos that are being built across the waterfront. So there's a kind of strategic use of contemporary art and the kind of critical art discourses that he's involved in and advocates within capital processes. Okay? But also, as I got more involved in Gean's interest and work, and through work I did at Cannonball with him, what became really clear was that, in a way, the horizon for Gean's activities and the way he operationalizes the art field in Miami, but also across the United States, is to try and face up to the condition of the Anthropocene, but also to not accept the standard notions of the Anthropocene. And I think that's what the talk tonight will be about. So, as well as being a director of Cannonball, a publisher with Name Publications, Gean is also a curator and an artist in his own right. He's shown in Europe, in the United States, and so on and so forth. The CVs on the VLE. So, with that, I'll introduce Gean. Do you want the lights at this level, or do you want them a bit?
Maybe a little bit lower.
Let's dim them down a bit.
Better. Okay. Should I start again? From the beginning? Okay. So the paper's called The Vacant Middle, Alternative Spaces and the Instrumentalization of the Anthropocene. And the first section is called Wolves at the Door. And it says, so I don't say much about the Anthropocene because I think we have a general sense of what it is. It's more about kind of criticisms to that general concept. So it says, the Anthropocene is the name that geologists and earth scientists are considering for our time. It is characterized by the effects that human activity has imprinted and will continue to imprint on the geology of the planet, while perhaps more alarmingly mutating the Earth's system. We are now, the idea goes, the dominant force in the shaping of the globe. Our actions are impinging on and disrupting the feedback loops that kept the planet running smoothly for 12,000 years. Future geologists, barring full biological extinction, will find evidence of our footprint in the fossil record, in the death inscriptions of whatever species emerge in the new environmental conditions caused by our actions. The anthropogenic effects usually considered to have produced the Anthropocene are those that emerged after the invention of the steam engine and the increase in the use of coal that accompanied the reproduction of the factory model. Right? So this is... But this moment of genesis, the point at which scientists will place the golden spike that marks epochal change, is itself contested. We have to wait until the findings of the International Commission on Stratigraphy are made public in 2016 to know if the Anthropocene is really a new age, the formal scientific period that follows the climactically stable Holocene, and when exactly it started. Although the most likely candidate for the Anthropocene's moment of inception is the rise of mass industry in the 18th century, some scientists are suggesting that we consider 1945 and the changes unleashed by nuclear detonations as a better possibility. This moment coincides with the beginning of the so-called Great Acceleration, in which agricultural and manufacturing production grew impressively, increasing resource extraction and consumption in the process, and exacerbating the pressure that was applied to the planet's systems. Lately, other potential dates have been proposed, most notoriously 1609, in which a discernible change to the planet's atmosphere, or marked drop in CO2, accompanied the massive genocide of indigenous peoples in the newly invaded American continent. Of course, regardless of what the stratigraphers decide, the Anthropocene is now a fugitive concept. It escaped the grip of the scientist and now roams in other fields and even in the Badlands between disciplinary enclosures. It has come to the attention of policy-producing think tanks, insurance firms, and has slipped into the intellectually unregulated spaces of the art world, flooding along the way and at an impressive clip the lowlands of curatorial thinking. It now demands innumerable symposia and structures all kinds of pedagogical initiatives in museums. The thing is, however, that the moment the concept of the Anthropocene left the preserve of scientific thought, its fate was sealed. The wolves would pick it apart. While it's undeniable that the metabolic rift between human activity and the planet's systems has become unsustainable, the spontaneous ideology of the scientist need not be naturalized. Jeremy Baskin, for instance, has argued that the Anthropocene as conceptualized and popularized by scientists is, this is quote, usefully understood as an ideology, in that it provides the ideational underpinning for a particular view of the world, which it, in turn, helps legitimate. It is a paradigm presented as an epoch, a filter to see the world through, and a normative guide to action. So that's the end of the quote. It sets up and supports a particular agenda by rendering commonsensical the call for massive geoengineering, planet managerialism, the rule of experts, usually of the scientific or engineering variety, twisting along the way the bedeviled earth-shaping capacity of human identity into an all of a sudden benevolent attribute. Pushed far enough, this discourse mutates into the delirious optimism of the Breakthrough Institute and the eco-modernists and their good Anthropocene, without pausing to question the underlying assumptions that guide it, the necessary collusion course with corporate and military power that it lays down, the conditions for disproportionate empowerment that it established for a particular field of endeavor, and the work it does on behalf of a rotten status quo. While the problems that Baskin points out are important, I want to claim some distance from his position, which seems to be sliding down a ravine of defeatism. The problem is not the geoengineering as such. It is the question of on whose behalf it is being undertaken and what the circumference of its benefit is. If the implicit benefits that a description extends to a particular field should make us pause, what of the implicit calumnies that it distributes? How is it that it came to pass that the anthropos, as such, the human species in its entirety, bears responsibilities for mutations to the planet's systems, the anthropogenic effects that have generated the most damage, regardless of where we decide to plot the beginning of the Anthropocene, come from particular places and practices, namely colonial and capitalist expansion as determined from centers of power. The attribution of the problems brought on by the capitalists to the rest of humanity exculpates the guilty parties while at the same time obfuscating the unrepentant continuity of the system's actions. Capitalism seems bent on extracting the last drop of life from the world that hosts it in order to keep itself in circulation until the very end. Daniel Hartney pushes things a bit further by showing how, beyond a generous redistribution of blame through the invention of its own figure of a de-differentiated humanity, mainstream Anthropocene discourse is guided by a technological bias that allows for schema that extirpates struggle as an essential component in historical development. It's new technologies, whether steam engine or the nuclear bomb, that determine the course of history and the social and geopolitical conditions in which these very technologies are enmeshed, and not the other way around. In so much Anthropocene discourse, not only are we all to blame, but our struggles against harmful practices, to say nothing of the collective intelligence manifested in our labor and its products, are of little consequence in both social evolution and the emergence of new technologies. History apparently happens without bodies and without resistance. So a final line of critical inquiry they should parse, since this is a room full of people who work in visual production, relates to the process and instruments of visualization that produce the images we use to explain and see or not see the Anthropocene. Nicholas Mirasov has proposed that we can't perceive the Anthropocene for at least two reasons. The first is that we have internalized its aesthetic. It's become an anesthetic, and it is the very thing that allows us to call destruction triumph and to locate and pillage the qualities of progress. The aesthetic is a technology of disregard. It keeps us from seeing the consequences of overstepping planetary boundaries. Mirosov employs George Wesley's Bellows painting 42 Kids from 1907, among other paintings, to explain our ways of unseeing the Anthropocene. The black river into which the kids in the painting are jumping was literally black and grossly polluted at the time that the painting was made. The sewage of 6 million New Yorkers ran directly into this body of water. Not only were there no complaints lodged at the time by local residents regarding the stink and look of the water, baffling the local bureaucracy, there is no mention of the pollution in the art history that has been dedicated to this painting. We see everything in the work except perhaps what is most obvious. The Anthropocene has taught us to practice selective viewing. The second reason for our incapacity to see the Anthropocene is that since it is as much inscriptions in the lithosphere as chemical recompositions of the atmosphere, as much lost species as ruined rivers, as much swelling CO2 concentration as rising rates of global warming, and it's all this at the same time, we can only visualize it like a general visualizing a battlefield. The metaphor is Nicholas Mirosov's, right, of the general. Assemble strands of data, conceptual syntheses, and experience or intuition take up the slack for mere physical perception. But visualizations, as the use of the general hints at, most often articulate themselves under the auspices of established authority and use its apparatuses. What we need are politicized counter-visualizations of the Anthropocene, visualizations that challenge the continuation of business as usual and our numbness to the state of affairs. Visualizations that duel with, and this is a quote, Anthropocene visuality that allows us to move on, to see nothing and keep circulating commodities despite the destruction of the biosphere. That's the end of the quote. That's Nicholas Mirosov again. And one can begin to do this by developing a kind of infrastructure for the exchange of relevant material, data, models, and programs of resistance to continued devastation. It's a rechanneling of resources and energy into the establishment of different spaces of knowledge production and vectors of distribution. Perhaps one way to understand the nature and complexity of the infrastructure that needs to be built, it's by considering the scale of the infrastructures that are currently employed to support the image of the Anthropocene that scientists have popularized. Over the course of 3 posts on Still Searching, the blog of the Photo Museum Winter Tour, TJ Demos unpacks the nature of the image technologies that are employed in explanations of the Anthropocene. He looks at the media artifacts that have become the go-to illustrational tools in scientific explanations of our current conditions, as these always seem to be products that circulate through highly controlled networks and rely on scripted protocols for their production. Looking at images and animations employed on educational web portals, the first thing Demos notices is the reliance, and this is a quote from him, a series of images with various representational modalities showing cities, shipping and air transport routes, pipelines, and submarine fiber optic cable systems, unquote, all meshed in order to reveal how large-scale human activity has turned the species into the dominant planet-shaping force. Putting aside for a moment, although he quickly returns to it, the question of who has access to and is responsible for these diagrammed infrastructures and route maps, Demos tackles instead the problem of our cognitive limitations and the technical limitations of easy-to-access image production tools in relation to the magnitude and dispersed nature of the Anthropocene. Our photographic technologies can only be found wanting before the loose-edge, multi-tier, radically dispersed object that they wish to grasp. Instead of mere photographs, Demos proposes that explanations of the Anthropocene rely on, and I quote, high-resolution satellite imagery that provides photographic-like pictures. That's important insofar as we've moved essentially beyond photography gauged to human perception to remote sensing technology scaled to global, even interplanetary visualizations. Seemingly existing as self-evident pictures, sat-nav imagery resembles and is often taken for photography, but actually comprises a composite set of digitized files, the result of processing quantities of remotely sensed data collected by satellite-based sensors. In most cases regarding lay usage, these images have also already been interpreted for viewers, or rather consumers, packaged as pictures without offering access to location data, ownership, legibility, and source information. The problem then is in the employment of these technologies and their images around Anthropocene discourse is that those who lean on the most rarely evince awareness of the use of such imagery or of the political implications of their representations, which not only help illustrate geological concepts, but also frame them in particular ways that are deeply political. So at the end, Demos calls for a return to photography as a critical medium to develop the critical images around the Anthropocene. He writes, in this regard, photography at its best plays a critical role raising awareness of the impact, showing the environmental abuse and human costs of fossil fuels' everyday operations, encouraging rebellious activist cultures like that currently taking place in Seattle's port, around which diverse communities and transnational organizations are building political alliances. But of course, photography alone will not be enough to develop this culture, nor should we, at the onset, surrender the possibility of working with other technologies, even tainted ones. There are things to be gleaned from satellite-produced imagery, from complex topographical mapping, and from the profit decline diagrams of insurance companies that have accepted a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature as an inevitable future. What we need, instead of returning to photography and other small practices like the pissed off op-ed or the committed studio practice, is to produce counter infrastructures, motley assemblages of distinct apparatuses and strands of knowledge, filtering mechanisms that could render transparent the backside of circulating sat-nav images and models, so as to make them useful beyond the intention behind them, networks that can generate material as compelling as that employed in the construction of popular views of the Anthropocene, but endowed with a critical dimension. And so I think this is important to not kind of go back to photography and these kind of smaller practices. And so this is an example of a project by Ala Plástica, who are an art group in Argentina. And what they are kind of trying to work against is this, which is the infrastructural integration of South America. So if this is your kind of your contender, I don't know what you're going to do with a photograph, right? So I think giving up these big infrastructure technologies from the outset is like a really terrible idea. I also think that attempting infrastructure thinking of this may also put some distance from the idea that sensing a toxic world through art and media artifacts is the most productive place for us to start, as currently seems to be the way the Anthropocene is being approached by contemporary art practice. What we need to do is work at the level of the support structure, right, of the presentational context, I think. So this is someone else who uses satellite imagery. This is Peter Fend. And so Peter Fend, in 1980, created a corporation called Ocean Earth, and he managed to source satellite imagery to produce biofuel proposals for Iraq during the first Gulf War. So, I mean, this is kind of studio practices, big scale thinking, I think, is what's important here. All right, so part 2 of the talk is called Bones Sharpened into Spears. Well, these criticisms that we parse slowly tear chunks from the self-assured descriptions of the scientist, unveiling ideological commitments just below the discursive pelt. It remains an incontrovertible fact that the Anthropocene is here, that planetary boundaries are being pressured to an unsustainable degree when not altogether exceeded, that biodiversity is shrinking and oceans are turning into necroscapes and acid pools, that ice sheets are melting and the globe is losing their indispensable reflective capacities, that the temperature is rising, and that no place is spared these effects, even if their intensity is unevenly distributed. Sea level rise here, drought there, superstorms on the coast, devastated ecosystems inland, the Earth system mutated and extinction on everyone's mind. We can call this geological era, or at least a compendium of anthropogenic effects that are indisputably altering planetary systems, the capital scene, or even the plantation scene, as Donna Haraway and others have suggested, if that helps. But what matters is the fact that the metabolic rift has intensified to the point that it marks, in Haraway's words again, an inflection point, and this is a quote, an inflection point of consequence that changes the name of the game of life on Earth for everyone and everything. That's the end of the quote. A better option, I think, than being against the Anthropocene as a program is to instrumentalize it in an effort to saturate the air of our institutions with the concerns that it drags through the door, and to do this with an eye on reformatting these institutions and forcing them to develop new missions and a new nimbleness so that they can become part of a larger infrastructure of partisan knowledge production. This will be a kind of paradoxical instrumentalization in the end, in that while the Anthropocene is treated as a tool in which to force alterations to current institutional architectures and habits, this takes place on the way to linking these repurposed institutions into a much broader counter-infrastructure of knowledge production that it will help us generate better pictures of the present and better modes of resistance to practices that exacerbate malignant anthropocentric effects. There may be something of a slippage here. It may be that it is ultimately our institutions that are being instrumentalized in order to accelerate the exercise of generating new critical knowledge. So I think for us in this room who work in contemporary art, I think that one of the added benefits of this option of trying to instrumentalize the Anthropocene is that at the very least it provides a stopgap to the way the concept of the Anthropocene is often used around contemporary art as a vague framework that relies on flimsy grasps of the interface between the human and the so-called natural world, harboring all sorts of ontologically unsustainable assumptions about these categories and the boundary between them. This fluffy usage is not innocuous. It fills spaces that can be employed doing much more serious work. And so I went to the Serpentine yesterday, and if you haven't been, there's a video with the hailstorm, and the curators decided that that had to do with environmental issues. And this is a problem, right? This is a repeating gesture in contemporary art institutions where everything has to do with environmental problems, and in the end, nothing really does. So I think trying to instrumentalize the Anthropocene as something we need to generate new knowledge for is a way to undercut that procedure, right? And it's, and there's people doing this. One way in which the Anthropocene is being instrumentalized in certain quarters is by posing very directly the question of how to mobilize the environmental effects that characterize the Anthropocene in order to reinforce the demands that are being articulated by particular activist practices. We have Naomi Klein and Brian Holmes, for instance, engaging in deliberate efforts to think climate change in relation to Black Lives Matter. Through a parallax shift from the immensity of planetary boundary thinking to surveying the traces left behind on bodies and in the environment actual populations dwell in, these thinkers bind current anthropogenic effects to phenomena such as the food deserts and pollution islands that poor neighborhoods currently are, the disproportionate distribution. This is the Philippines, but I want to show you this. I lost my place. The disproportionate distribution of health burdens to the global south that result from the consumption practices of the North Atlantic countries, as shown in this map. The genocide and displacement of First Nations peoples. But the shift in perspective also allows them to think about things from the opposite end. It's the ideological configurations, the lingering colonial script that allows us to demean and erase bodies, to break them down to reductive versions of themselves, to produce the conditions for this to be acceptable and even profitable through things like mass incarceration, that also determine and naturalize a correlation between resource inaccessibility and distribution of poor populations, and that allows us to get by without a robust understanding of how planetary systems work outside of their ability to generate profit, without developing the capacity to think natural resources as more than merely free or cheap nature that we should appropriate, and without having to consider the larger picture of an entire Earth system that can be affected by unfettered practices of local devastation. Okay. So part 3 is called Wild Realities. So closer to home, that is bringing things back into the space of art production, a site that might be ripe for reformatting, motivated by the demands that an instrumentalization of the Anthropocene may shove in its direction. It's the alternative space. Now, alternative spaces have always been inseparable from social history. They've sought to establish new ways of producing and circulating art beyond the limited options that capitalist relations afford cultural production, even as certain spaces have at one time or another worked against this very mission, becoming sad way stations between educational institution or underground scene and market. For a long time, however, the abstractions that the alternative space as a certain kind of entity stood against were clear: the commodity form, the exchange relation, etc. Of course, in taking the stance, the alternative space has always lived in a historical lag. It faced off against the commodity form in the market while becoming a prototype for the very source structure that capitalist development would need to move production out of the traditional workplace and have it saturate the entire social field. So I want to address this problem here of the alternative space as a prototype for a kind of post-Fordist economy. Instead, I want to propose that we seem to have hit a threshold at which the alternative space needs to face the problems generated by novel transactions and displacements of molecules. It now needs to begin to contribute knowledge to a better understanding of the situation we're in and to the mitigation of intensifying anthropogenic effects. This is how it responds to what is quickly becoming an emergency. Here, then, is the pertinent question for those in the business of presenting contemporary art while attempting to maintain a particular politics. What should an alternative space as a topology that still wants to stand for progressive claims look like in the Anthropocene? And perhaps more poignantly, is the alternative space as we know it even equipped for the new demand that is being put to it? Native to an age that doesn't quite look like ours, can it expand its program to deal with new realities? And if it can't, then what replaces it? What does it morph into? What kind of structure would make sense in its place? So how did I get here? How did I come to the conclusion that the alternative space is a site worth investing some energy and thinking on? Why do I think that it's ripe for reordering and for linking into a larger infrastructure of critical knowledge production? The answer, I think, comes from three places. I work at a non-for-profit organization and have attempted to treat the space as a bit of a living lab, and we could talk about that in the Q&A more specifically. I think empirical observation of other spaces in the field more generally, and I just want to emphasize that maybe this is a bit of an American perspective. You know, what I'll say about alternative spaces and what the field looks like, it's bound to an American context just because that's where I work. And the third thing is that I'm interested in the processing of experience and observation through particular theoretical schema. The importance of the latter for me lies in that I take the following axiom as a filtering mechanism. The distortion is in the immediate manifestation and not in the projective view. This is just good old location logic that has come down to us in various forms. The easiest to identify for me as a cultural producer being the practices of Italian radical architecture. In the cheapest shorthand, the idea is that we find in objective forms the process of their social reproduction. What we see as stable is they are also in movement as part of a trajectory. And this allows us to engage in projective mapping, in the production of cartographies that forecast where things are headed, and perhaps even how we may carve out ways to deviate from these potential routes and seemingly inevitable endpoints. It's a mapping that may just allow us to pick up on the wild realities that may be imminent in the trajectories we're plotting. The term wild realities comes from the Florentine architectural studio Arcazum, and more specifically, from No Stop City, a project the group developed between 1968 and 1970. And this is how they explain it. These wild realities represent each time a leap forward and at the same time the obscure intent of a foreign body within a rational mechanism. Now, to be clear, the rational mechanism that they're talking about is the capitalist production of the city. Because for them, there's no other production for the city, right? There's no alternative city to be had. So in a series of text and graphic renditions that they presented as an instruction manual, No Stop City is the group's effort to map the mutation of the city in light of the capitalist trajectory which led production out of the traditional workspace and into the whole of society. That is, they're plotting the urban response to the development of social relations necessary to render activities undertaken outside of formal work as productive, as able to generate value and profit for others. And when value begins to be extracted from consumption, turning the house and sites of leisure into spaces of production, Arcazum proposes, the heterogeneous morphology of the city is disassociated from the isotropic spread of infinite points of production. Work is everywhere, while the city retains the illusion of functional distinctions. What Arcazum deduces in the end is that the new city as a social factory is one endless interior determined by its infrastructure. So this image is one of their diagrams. The new city as social factory is just air conditioning and bathrooms. Pattern regularity as a guide to behavior. This is its truth. Architectural iconicity is just a perpetuation of ideology. Buildings are just bullshit. Today, we would only need to add routers and speeding drone shadows to update this picture, and perhaps acknowledge, additionally, that the rise of speculation as urban planning returns some function to the iconic building, and that the factory is now fully cybernetic and increasingly transforms human effort and intelligence into autonomous machines of production aided by global logistics. Arcasum, this is another one of the diagrams, produces a disenchanted representation of the city. It renders every part of it identical by exteriorizing the hidden infrastructure, which is what is truly relevant at the moment in the capitalist development of the city when everyone has been turned into a producer. The difference between the shantytown and the condo tower becomes obsolete to this capitalist trajectory, while of course Wi-Fi and mobile phone accessibility are indispensable. Our time only ratifies the tendency that Arcasum was on the trail of at the end of the 1960s, and hacker culture draws its outlines. According to Pier Vittorio Aureli, for Arcasum, and I quote, "The city had to be theorized in terms of its most advanced stage of development, in essence ad absurdum, in its extreme consequences, to the point where these consequences were not even controllable by the system itself." That's the end of the quote. The city had to be liberated from its image because it is only when what is really taking place in it, what is coming, at its most intense and engulfing is depicted, that the wild reality of its appropriation by the actual producers laboring in it could finally materialize. Arcasum wanted to present a cold picture of the city, a future version of it determined by the end point of the trajectory it was on, in order to instantiate the possibility of a working class takeover. All right, so this is the last section, and it's called the vacant middle. To projectively map the trajectory of alternative spaces in search of a wild reality that may be imminent in historical unfolding is not too difficult, considering how clear the lines of movement have become in recent years. The field is at a point of bifurcation. Political demands and the need for greater efficiency in addressing particular social injustices are forcefully pulling certain spaces in one direction. The limitations inherently established by funding structures and philanthropic habits are dragging other spaces in the very opposite direction. One side is pulling towards active political work that falls outside the domain of the alternative space, insofar as it will eventually have to rescind its mission to engage contemporary art practices in the name of a laudable efficiency in addressing specific instances of injustice and building up a greater degree of political coherence. The other side is on the way to becoming a stereo mirror of the market and one of its tools of distillation, rendering any form of dissidence it may want to engage with a vacuous paradox. Two limit situations on the horizon then. Before I go, so this, I just got this coincidentally. So this is kind of the oldest, most prominent alternative space in Miami. And, so this is the oldest and kind of most prominent alternative space in Miami. And I think it's self-explanatory in relation to what I'm talking about, right? So two limit situations are on the horizon then. If one dreams of exacerbating the tendency that they signal, it is only because one senses that the vacant middle ground that is straining to articulate itself between them, the swelling space of their disagreement, brims with new possibilities. Instrumentalizing the Anthropocene is a tactic to turn the passive waiting for the center to completely clear into a step in seizing and squatting in the present, this future space. Ours should be a kind of interventionist exercise in cartography. One plots a tendency as an exercise in seeking or inventing opportunities to deviate from it, in the quest for imminent divergences. A tendency is in the end that which is ultimately verified and whose contours are sharpened by the practices and consequences of veering from it. The bifurcation that characterizes the field at the moment is not quite a break in the historical continuum of the alternative space, but something closer to the resolution of a contradiction that was always at the heart of it, and which have may grown more acute with the emergence of neoliberal policies. This contradiction being a desire for a radical break with the system, and particularly with a range of minimal and circumscribed affordances capitalism extends to cultural production, and a nearly absolute economic dependence on the state or on individuals and corporate entities that draw most benefit from the economic system that the state protects. As this contradiction unravels and opens two divergent paths for traditional spaces, in the vacant middle, a wild reality, a potential reformatting of the alternative space that re-embraces this contradiction, refusing the illusion that at the moment our production can completely disentangle itself from market forces without embodying conventional forms. Instead, the alternative space reinvents itself as a node in a counter-infrastructure of unfettered knowledge production, as a kind of wandering potentiality that could assume the proper provisional form for the projects it takes on, without in the end retaining any of these forms permanently, shedding the limitation of being a discrete object with a stable internal identity. At the risk of calling up cheap vitalisms, we can think of this potential new version of the alternative space as a shape-shifting organism rather than a finished artifact. It has a core, right? Where else does the grant writing happen, right? But it also has a liquid skin, a renewed plasticity, adapted interfaces. These are malleable in relation to both the projects that the space presents or engages with, which themselves have to be of a different nature, attuned to the qualities and goals of this new presentational context, and in relation to the ways in which it links to a larger infrastructure of knowledge production. In this way, the alternative space retains autonomy as a presentational site, or more broadly, as a site still involved with art production, while finding ways to leverage whatever new material it generates in more effective ways by aggregating it to a larger network of knowledge. The burden placed on this reformatted version is that of retaining a fundamental stereoscopic vision that allows it to keep in focus two things at once. Its mission as a protected site for deviant art projects as epistemological and effective machines, that is, as knowledge producers and political mobilizers, and as a link to a larger infrastructure of knowledge production. This second aspect is also a way to mitigate the problem of scale. Rather than attempt to scale up the alternative space into something that will render it seemingly more effective and relevant in the current conjuncture, such as an ICA or some kind of quasi-museum, why not treat the problem of scale as a problem of linkage, and prototype ways in which the alternative space becomes a valuable node in a larger infrastructure of knowledge production and dissemination. But why pine for the middle, right? Why not milk the fantasy of an outside? And it's because in the vacant middle, access to important funding will still be available. And this funding, tainted as it may be, will provide the tools and help erect the platforms for production and dissemination of new knowledge. It is also a place that will be familiar enough for other institutions in the local culture ecologies to recognize. This is more opportunism than reconciliation. It's the vulgar pragmatism that allows Americans to tag dignity to incremental construction as long as the consequences along the way are significant enough. That being said, one still treads cautiously here, knowing that one is always a small step away from having to cave to the unspoken demands that most funding possibilities carry with them, demands that incorporate the alternative space into the moral economy of art's current marketization. The empty middle will also be a place where the opportunities the field has collectively worked for over the last half-century will be available, and from these perhaps new ones will emerge. Of course, these unprecedented opportunities will only be there when they are generated by the people who decide to inhabit and work in this vacant middle. They will be constituted in practice through the hunt for loopholes in the current funding structures, through creative wording in grant applications, and the inventiveness of the artists who are engaged, in the cleverness of the right directors of development, in the seduction of new supporters, in the adventure of devising fluid yet precise identities, in the push to run on coherence mode with other fields. Living in this middle would be an experimental practice, a navigational exercise for which our current projective mapping helps develop initial routes. And these initial routes will ultimately be superseded by charts devised along the way, with the clear understanding that emerges with doing. This alternative space autonomy will not be from existing systems in a gesture of absolute rupture. This is just a fantasy. The autonomy is for its self-construction as a more relevant tool in building a knowledge base that is not completely regimented by the needs of capitalist expansion. Now that the universalization of the damage unleashed by anthropogenic effects has changed the rules of the game, and preferring not to is a way of preferring to by other means, it will be initiatives within the field, active attempts to diverge from inertial tendencies that produce innovation and possibility. The work to be done has to be done within. That's it.
So I'm going to kind of quickly reconstruct the broad outline to kind of formulate some questions. Also appreciate that it's a really fetid atmosphere in here, so I'm going to try and be quick and then just throw it open to questions. So the beginning of the talk is the criticism that pictures of people suffering in the Anthropocene, producing counter politics through specific actions or specific photographs, specific images, doesn't capture the kind of systematicity, like the overallness of the Anthropocene. So we need something that operates at the level of infrastructures rather than particular images or specific interventions. And then the second section is the appeal to what you call big-scale thinking. So it's the same, in a way, it's the same argument, which is rather than the specific photograph of decaying animal in a desert or people being sort of migrating out of desertified areas to places with better economies and more food. Rather than acting on that specific case, we need to kind of consider like the large-scale picture. Right? The question is, how do you do large-scale picture without reproducing the kind of images that you were showing of trade routes and sort of flights and this kind of stuff? And then you move to the question of alternative spaces as the kind of mediating point in a way between what one can do as an art field, like the curator or the artist or the person involved in the art field, which is kind of still predominantly concentrated or structured around individuals, rather than, I mean, of course there are structures in museums and so on, but all of these fetishize individuals, either through the figure of the curator or the figure of the director, the figure of the artist. And insofar as they specify individuals, they divert attention away from big scaleness back to an equivalent of the photograph, of the specific photograph. So you're saying, let's look at alternative spaces. And the reason to look at alternative spaces, as I understood it, but this is partly clarification I may want, is that in a way, the alternative space hasn't yet completely conceded to either the market mechanisms of contemporary art, but also, in a way, what the alternative art space offers is one, an institutional basis rather than individuals acting. But secondly, it's an institution in which it's relatively small scale, but it's connected into a system. Right? So you can act somewhat locally or somewhat individualistically, but understanding yourself in the art ecology through the alternative space, it plays a role in the movement of culture and the movement of art and the movement of ideas through the culture as a whole. So the standard transition would be something like curator artist has an exhibition in alternative space that gets some attention from a well-funded space or like visibility somewhere, and then that enters into a larger economy. So there's a way through the alternative space that you can shift. Well, you can do two things. You can shift cultural dynamics, but also you can connect up quite immediate actions, or what you called, you didn't say they were immediate, quite the opposite, distorted, sort of distorted actions. You can in a way infect the circulation of culture through the alternative space model. But the alternative, so that's why alternative space, and also you run one as well. Right? So in a way, people like us can do something at larger scales than individuals by understanding ourselves as institutional actors through alternative spaces that we can shape rather than be subject to. But what the problem you see with alternative spaces is, on the one hand, in the current system, on the one hand, they're heading towards being black mirrors of the market, like market feeders, which in a way don't do anything to transform the cultural dynamic. And secondly, they end up in a kind of activist, this is the thing I wasn't quite clear about, they end up in a kind of activist political work which ends up being too local, too specific. Right? So you're saying that the alternative space in its current configuration isn't quite up to the task of the big scale thinking that's needed for the Anthropocene, because there's a kind of empty middle. Right. So that's the sort of overall, I mean, there's lots of stuff in there which I couldn't write down fast enough, but that was my sense of the kind of trajectory. And then at the end, you're kind of saying that it was an anti-middle? A vacant middle? Right. There's a vacant middle through alternative space that could be occupied, which on the one hand, it's not at all pure space because they're funded, you have to write the grant applications, that comes with strings. But nonetheless, we could still act through through this kind of vacant middle, which is in a way affirming the institution as institution, right? As an alternative space, which isn't the alternative to institutionalization, but an alternative to both market mechanisms and this kind of one-off activist model that you've shown through TJ Davis, right? So there's something to be done in the kind of culture and the kind of spaces that we're involved with in courses like this one, which are actually very appropriate to doing something which doesn't correspond to either the sort of top-down images of the Anthropocene, but also doesn't leave us in a kind of atomized individualism where we can't act because we're very small actors against a very big problem. But that's not to say that the alternative space has to remain outside all economies and all logics, but it actually has to actively understand its role in them and mobilize it. So that is that?
No.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that one of the important things is that it should be self-aware as an institutional player in a field, the alternative space. So, so the place I work for, I imagine its partners to be something like the Abbas Center for Environmental Studies at the University of Miami, not the artist that gets to show there, right? So the partner or the infrastructure you can build is with other small institutions. And that still allows you to maintain kind of your mission to present art, but at the same time, now as a presentational context, you are forcing artists to think differently too, right? So if you're bound in a kind of network with different environmental study groups, environmental justice groups, it may not make sense to have an artist come in and show paintings, right? Now the artist too has to kind of somehow engage this new context that you've produced. And I think in the States it's kind of a bit clear that alternative spaces are actually moving in these two directions. On the one hand, they're just becoming social justice spaces. So they become community groups, and it ceases to make sense for them to keep an art mission, right? That just kind of slows them down, and their efficaciousness kind of gets diluted. So one of the problems that they face is that then they get excluded from the funding cycles, right? Because they do kind of social justice, so they then have to invent kind of new funding models. And in the other space, as kind of the money becomes more private for alternative spaces, the alternative spaces respond by catering to what that private money wants. So if a developer in Miami is going to put $60,000 for your program, it's going to be a Jim Lambie show or something, right? It's not going to be 3 kids just out of school, right? So it comes to consolidate around the market more and more. So I think in there in between there's some way to work in which you're not innocent about the way the funding works, but you're also not. You have enough clarity to know that you could start bending your institution to do other things, something like that.
Okay. So my question, which I guess I'll ask one question and see if there are others from the floor. My question, I guess, is around it kind of makes sense if you're the director of, let's present our hypothesis, you're a director of an alternative space in a city which has a university which deals with ecology, dealing with redevelopment, thinking about rising water level rises and so on. It's kind of, you can imagine constructing or even engineering a space which makes these transversal connections across disciplines, making artists or curators responsible to, in a way, non-standard demands from the art field. So rather than, like, what does your exhibition mean in frieze, the question is, what does it mean in terms of the problem presented by the water engineer dealing with changes in the city in the next 20 years, right? So I can see how, as somebody who's running a space, you can make demands on artists, curators, us, right, to rethink your practice. But my question, I guess, is to do with it's a kind of how do you attach small scale initiatives at the level of the individual? Because the contemporary art model is still very much about individual practices. I mean, you get some collectives, but they're also very small scale as well, like a few people, not many people. How do you attach small scale practices, either of an individual or a small group, to large scale ramifications without becoming an activist group? So if you start as the artist or the individual curator, how do you make demands upon existing alternative spaces to change the direction, change the kind of activities you're doing? So in a way, your presentation assumes that you run a space, which you do, and you can sort of engineer the space and sort of like do stuff with artists and to artists and curators to make them responsible to a large scale problem. But if you're coming in as an emerging curator or as an emerging artist or something, saying, well, we have to think about a condition, what you call, how do we chase a toxic chase? How do we chase it? How do we sense a toxic world? Right? That's the issue. I don't want to simply reproduce or show images of natural disasters, because that's just what you get in Sunday supplements and the front page of a newspaper. You want to do something that's more active without being activist. What would an artist or a curator do to an alternative space in the art field that would ask it to sort of change its standard operating model?
Right, but so I think you just flip it, right? So if your studio practice is ambitious and it's large scale thinking, then you put the demands on the alternative space to stop being this kind of small scale initiative of like, let's try to get the money together to put up some drawings, right? Like you pressure the alternative space to start thinking at your scale. So I think it's possible to, it's either or, right? Either the alternative space is putting a demand on the artist to think at another scale, or artists can kind of think on the scale and make these kind of inertial habits of the alternative space be shaken up. So when Peter Fend walks in somewhere with satellite imagery, the institution has to respond to this, right? So when he comes in, he says, I need $3,500 to source satellite imagery over area X because I'm doing a project on eco-taxation. The alternative space has to either step up or just not show up. But I mean, there's a way to negotiate it from the other end as well. The ambition has to be in the practice.
So it's not necessarily the case that to do big scale projects you need to have a lot of people working at a big scale. I mean, you can have like the demand of the project can be big scale, involving kind of quite a large infrastructure.
Yeah, I think maybe the difference is that as an artist, you have a trajectory that you're following, right? And if you make an ambitious and big scale thinking sort of thing, you can get so far. And the difference is maybe the institution can link up to multiple lines of big thinking, right? So back home, for instance, we did a short intensive on art on the Anthropocene. And one of the people brought was an attorney who works at a think tank for divestment groups, right? Fossil fuel divestment. So this is, if I ran an alternative space thinking of in terms of exhibitions, there's no way I would try to link that. There was no reason why I would link that kind of knowledge base to what I'm thinking, right? So I think it's both. I think that's the difference. The alternative space actually links up to multiple interfaces, as opposed to the artist. It just has kind of like one trajectory.
Just one more question. So in a way, what you're not quite proposing, but what's implicit in what you just said is that in a way the space moves away from being like an exhibition venue or a kind of venue for people to arrive at to do stuff, to becoming like an operational mode within an infrastructure, right? So the alternative space, like the demand might not be to present an exhibition after 6 weeks of preparation and be open for 3 weeks to show up and so on and so forth. But what would be interesting for a space in your model would be maybe to close down the exhibition aspect. Cannibal doesn't have an exhibition space directly. You can use others, but to close down the exhibition aspect and to think about what the artist, the curator, the other people involved could do working across institutions and use the space as an operator.
Yeah, but I also think it's an opportunity for the artist to respond to the demands, the presentational content. It's an opportunity for the artist to also kind of respond to the demands that an altered presentational context puts on them. So if the presentational context is about generating new knowledge, then maybe the artist too has to figure out how his practice generates useful knowledge that then can be inserted into larger infrastructures. So I think it's not just this is my team of artists who do stuff that I like, and these are guys that I'll never deal with. It's more like you're coming into a presentational context that has been altered, and that puts a demand on your practice. Do you wish to address that demand somehow?
Question.
Hi, sorry if I get anything wrong, because you were speaking really quickly on your presentation, but it seems there's a sort of, I'd like you to maybe just clarify or address kind of a contradiction in the idea of instrumentalization, because you mentioned that I think you said you have a desire to instrumentalize the Anthropocene, right? But in a way, it seems that the Anthropocene is also being allowed to instrumentalize what you would consider correct or the right way of doing art practice or alternative space-based practice, and also in the relation between the alternative space that you're sort of suggesting and the artist. So in one sense, you say the artist that has a big thinking kind of project will pose challenges and put pressures on the institution to either accept that and accommodate it or not. And on the other hand, it's the other way around. It's the artist that is coming into contact with this kind of new institution will have to either address what they're doing. So straighten that out for me a bit.
So I think at some point I say that it's a bit of a paradoxical instrumentalization. So you're kind of using the concerns that the Anthropocene brings to kind of accelerate the change inside the alternative space. But if you're changing them towards kind of binding that alternative space to these kind of infrastructure of knowledge, maybe the alternative space is also being instrumentalized by a need to produce this knowledge about the Anthropocene. So there's somehow a Mobius strip kind of moment there. No?
No, yeah, I want to follow up on it, but maybe it's not my turn.
I'm going to follow up, because I don't think you'd be satisfied with that answer.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, why art? I mean, why? Why is it that that the best way, if we're concerned about the Anthropocene, or whatever that is, why is it that that contemporary art, or whatever the new X art is going to be, has anything to add to this, or can possibly be the best medium by which solutions or branching into other institutions or infrastructure networks is enacted?
I have to repeat the question in case people don't hear it. So the question is, why bother with contemporary art if you want to deal with the Anthropocene, and why not just fold into activism and let contemporary art just do what it does anyway?
Yeah, go into politics.
Or just go into politics. So why would there be demand on art?
Right. So I think this is a problem that. So I start from the place that I work inside the art field, and this is just my neighborhood. So I have to know. I mean it. Yeah. I mean I feel like what you're saying makes absolute sense until you look at it from where you are in your life every day. So I get up in the morning and I have to go to work in an alternative space. So I need to construct this space in what I think is a more interesting way. So it's this very pragmatic. So when I did the accelerations thing in Reflux, what I was interested was what are the aesthetics of this, right? Not how we're gonna like redline capitalism, like what is in my field. So I try to be a bit from a very pragmatic place to ask these questions, from sitting behind my desk in my office and asking what am I doing.
So there's already a crisis in art for that to be a question, right?
Yeah, I guess I begin from that place.
Okay, I see there's another question, but my response, well, it's not my talk, would be that art's already making content, contemporary art's already making content claims on this stuff. So questions are those content claims, art about the environment, ecology, any politics at all, are they actually political? Or are they kind of shadows or proxies or alibis for politics? And in fact sort of reduces what could be politics. Now, if you want to have an art with content claims which are current and have traction on the world, how do you do that? And it seems to me like what Gean is saying, like the standard model of just having a photograph, the TJ Demos like way, like a counter photograph to the corporate image, isn't going to do it. And that seems to me right, because if you go and see shows about the Anthropocene, it's like it's about the Anthropocene, but it's not doing it. There's a question.
Yeah, I think it was like really, I mean, I thought your use of the word like imminence is actually a really spectacular way to talk about, I suppose, like, what would be like immediate planetary death that is kind of always happening. And I guess kind of a follow-up to that as well, like, I suppose it also has to do with the talk we had last week, where they talked about kind of a morality or a type of morality that could kind of exist in the Anthropocene that doesn't try to fall into, I guess, the traps of like of like mid-century or like, you know, early 19th century morality that's very, you know, human-centric but like the direct kind of binderism of that would be to kind of just view humans as like, you know, actual animals on this planet. And they're trying to kind of be a middle ground to that. And with this sort of eminence is kind of a zero-sum game. And that would seem so with like, you know, I guess how we talk about the Anthropocene, or I suppose like, you know, the kind of direct impact that we're having on our planet. And I guess my question is, would you like, you know, think, this kind of, would there be another way to sort of think about this through art that is not a zero-sum game, or with still, while still acknowledging the kind of happenings that are occurring climately? And
Could you just kind of say again why you think there's zero-sum game?
Well, it's like, it's either kind of we are directly, you know, we either directly involve ourselves with it and take direct responsibility and act as the kind of, you know, I guess, moral centers of the planet, or we kind of, you know, distance ourselves and kind of view ourselves as human as solely animal. And it would seem like that there's this sort of binarism there that is a little, I mean, that's kind of unsatisfying, and I guess that would be, I guess, what we were talking about in the third part of your talk, this sort of, is there a way to work within it? Yeah, sorry.
Just kind of the questions around the moral position that one takes, whether you just kind of abandon traditional kind of anthropocentric. You weren't here to talk last week, but Johannes Zelinska was saying that what the Anthropocene demands is like an abandonment of anthropocentric ethics, where humans are kind of primarily involved with other humans. But that leaves problems like, well, who's the moral agent here?
Well, no, not so much that, but it's like how do you kind of, I guess, mobilize people like that, like without thinking like we are directly involved, like we are directly responsible for this. We can directly, you know, I guess, or attempt to kind of sort this out without it sort of acting like some sort of like moral center, or without us acting like some sort of guardian. Like, would it be possible to kind of, would it be possible, you think, to like, I guess, mobilize people or create art around that does sort of treat human as animal, how it also treats, you know, this, you know, this global problem as, you know, a problem.
I guess.
Ask the questions.
Yeah, I can't repeat it.
Yeah.
So I'll try to articulate what I think you said, and you tell me if I'm right. So you're saying, is there a way for art objects to create some kind of new narrative of
Yeah.
how we function on the planet?
Yeah, or how we, I guess, relate to it whilst also not, I guess, directly kind of reflecting every other sort of narrative that's already been put in place by either, you know, by either like kind of like a sort of corporate narrative or like, you know, like kind of reenacting some narrative.
Yeah, I think for me that question would revolve around symbolic action versus some kind of use.
Mhm.
What is it for beyond a symbolic presentation? Because we already do that, right?
Yeah.
This is what art that usually circulates around the Anthropocene already is. This is kind of symbolic presentation of maybe our place in the planet somehow displaced. And on the one hand that, and on the other hand, the other kind of work that goes around the Anthropocene is a presentation of the facts of our presence or our actions. So I'm just wondering, how do you get beyond the symbolic presentation, right? How do you activate something? And I don't know that activating a narrative for an audience is enough, right? I would want to know what the real use of this, right? How do you collate information, and how do you put different lines of knowledge production together?
Okay.
Sorry. I was just possibly throwing a wrench into this folks here, but I'm interested in what, if any, role you see for absurdity as an aspect of this, of the kind of language that's inserted into this kind of other form of knowledge production. I just bring it up because it strikes me, I don't know if you'd agree with this reading of Arcazine, but my reading of their work at large is a kind of absurdity that supersedes the kind of remodeling, the hallucinatory remodeling of a pre-existent critical examination of the world that science fiction would kind of model, and more towards more of an exploding of the problematics to such a level of absurdity that everything is laid bare. So it strikes me that just in terms of like, I feel like there's an ambiguous claim as to how this knowledge production would form. There seems to be an investment in newness, but I'm not sure like what voicing that is, and whether I personally think that could be productive, but I don't know. I'm interested too.
So I would think that art consume, the absurdity would be actually diagramming what the capitalist trajectory is, right? It would be diagramming it at its kind of endpoint. So is this what you mean by absurdity?
I think I mean just in terms of like graphic representations that actually become kind of comical in their distancing from, the sort of those constructed models. I forget how you articulated it, but those, the kind of HD composite, diagrams that have a kind of truth claim, that's a sort of manipulative construct, and that the absurdity of blowing that apart seems like a really productive, critical way of dismantling that, rather than, you're saying just to sort of co-opt those mechanisms and rework with them, and it, by invoking Arcazine, it seems like it needs to be more explosive than just remodeling or rearticulating those visual languages. Does that make sense?
So the issue you're asking is with Arcazine, if Gean's claim is like to follow through the trajectories to the very end, like further than go themselves, with Arcazine you end up with kind of an absurd image, which in a way undoes its operational effectiveness. Like you can't actually use that sort of image.
Yeah.
And in a way that's the kind of critical moment. And that's a counterpoint to Gean's other claim, which is that what you have to do with the art field is actually become much more operationally effective. So in a way you can't afford to have an absurd image. Because if you go with an absurd image to a geoengineering lab and say, let's work together, they'll say, well, can't do anything with this image power. It's kind of...
Yeah, I think that the difference might be that Arcasum understood that there was no architecture to be done in a capitalist city. There was no alternative city to be produced. So you just had to kind of develop theories of these capitalist trajectories. And I think that we can't afford to do that anymore because these anthropogenic effects are very real. And so at some point, you have to mobilize art objects and art projects in the generation of actual knowledge, not just these kind of diagrams that, what are you calling, absurd? So it's no longer about kind of showing how bad things can get. It's about actually somehow trying to mitigate some of this. So Arcasum, I think, would never, the Arcasum of that period anyways, would never accept that mitigation was possible to these capitalist development trajectories.
I'm going to take one last question because I realize there's the meeting afterwards and everybody's kind of fainting already. So.
Yeah, so my question is, so by positioning an alternative space in the vacant middle, as you say, which you describe as a site for the production and dissemination of new knowledge. So by making that move, aren't you just like risking like reproducing the immanent knowledge like within the system? Because like surely the kind of strength of an alternative space is that it's slightly outside of a system, right? That there's some bit of transcendence or whatever that allows you to have that distance and then critique it or do something with it. But you're positioning it right in the center, so aren't you just risking reproducing the kind of crap that you're trying to get out of?
No, I think you're creating a space where this kind of, let's call it mainstream knowledge production, can start to be questioned, and where maybe strands that don't meet elsewhere can meet there. So, I mean, I don't think that, right, so I don't think the alternative in alternative space stands for alternative anymore, the way maybe it did at some point. I mean, these are kind of spaces that function within either market economies or they're just off to the edge doing local community work wherever they're sited. So I think that this just becomes a space where all kinds of truth claims out there can start to be kind of tested and interrogated and from different angles. And I think it's also a place where you can start meshing lines of knowledge that maybe function in discrete kind of spaces in the world. And so the alternative space allows you to start meshing these things.
It's also a spot where relatively unknown or new practitioners from the art field can have traction within Gean's model, can have tractions on things that aren't in the art field as artists, right? Or as curators or as art practitioners rather than just as sort of social activists or something like this. So it's a kind of important to come back to a point in your paper around mediation. They kind of become, because they're institutions, they're recognized actors in the social field with funding and so on and so forth. So the space kind of becomes something upon which individual practitioners or small groups of practitioners can act and make a demand, and through that mobilize other institutions in a way that would be quite difficult for an individual to do. So that's the notion of an alternative space, which isn't necessarily alternative to the notion of institutions, but other kinds of action than the sort of standard abundant kinds of action. I think that would be kind of argument, is understand it, and certainly I've seen with Biennial. Okay, I'm kind of sensing, did you have a question? Or you're just flexing your hand? I kind of want to...
It's just like it has to do with what you're talking about. Because
very quickly.
In some sense, would this idea be like of making the artist work, which is already, I feel, in some sense transdisciplinary as you're proposing, bring it to like a macro idea of trying to reach things that wouldn't be possible?
I'm not sure I completely follow what you said. You said it's making the artist work.
Because I already feel artistic work is already transdisciplinary. Like every artist is already going like in its own demands of his own works and experiences. to try to understand things from different points of view. I don't see like a contemporary artist being like narrow focused in one only thing, but like trying to understand the world in different perspectives. Because like, so like I was trying to understand if like your proposition would be this possibility of thinking of one thing into different perspectives, to a macro perspective, instead of just like being inside a studio or inside like an artwork, but actually in a social space where people would.
Right, but maybe there's something about the accumulation of knowledge as well. So, you know, if over a 10-year period in alternative space, if you manage it a particular way, there's a cumulative effect of building knowledge in a way that maybe I'm not sure can be as diverse within an artist's studio practice, right? Because you're kind of getting things from multiple directions and multiple interests. And so you just, as an alternative space, I think your job is to somehow be able to collect these strands of knowledge and make them kind of reinforce each other and maybe start developing new possibilities from that.
Yeah, I'd also add that, although it's certainly the case that contemporary artists, as individuals, their practices are transversal or kind of multidisciplinary and multi-perspectival. The scale at which they aim, the ambition of the practice isn't that large, can't be, because it's individualized. It always comes back to subjective position, always, but it has to come back to subjective position. So if you have something like the Anthropocene, or a global condition, or something like a toxic planet, and you want to address it at its scale, the question is how do you scale up from the contemporary artist moment to like the adequate form of action? And that's where the space kind of becomes an important mediator for it.
And I also think, maybe to your point as well, is as an institution and retaining somehow your identity as an institution, you can actually kind of daisy chain with other institutions, where maybe this for an artist might be a different thing. So if an artist were to go to an environmental institute, he would go in as a, you know, as an agent coursing through this kind of thing, through this institution. And maybe as an alternative space, you have a different relationship of linkage with these other similar sized institutions.
Okay, let's stop there. Thank you, Gean. Thanks.